welcome to Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, and along with my co-host, Chris Kaye, we discuss and dissect our favorite music, heavy metal. So sit back, relax, pop open a cold one, and let the debate begin. Hello everyone, and welcome to the debut episode of Debating Metal. I'm Kenneth Dean.
And I'm Chris Kaye.
Today we'll be introducing ourselves and discussing our favorite bands and what heavy metal means to us. Over the coming weeks, we'd like to get your feedback and read your opinions online on subjects we talk about and what your feelings are on heavy metal and hard rock. So I'm going to begin today by sharing my story about when I first heard heavy metal, hard rock, or something like that. And it began in October of 1977 when I first saw a commercial for Kiss Alive 2, the new Kiss album that was coming out. And there was just, I saw the commercial, there's fire, there was explosion, there was blood, there was smoke, and it was so cool. I immediately got attracted to it. And from there, it was on. But then after that, I really didn't listen to much hard rock or heavy metal other than Kiss until 1980 when I experienced AC/DC's Let There Be Rock movie for the first time. What about you?
I was born 1986, a little bit after the biggest, portion of the origins of metal. It wasn't really until I was about 10 to 14 years old, in that range where I really started listening to metal. I grew up listening to a lot of what my parents listened to, which was more on the soft side. My mom was a big Kenny G fan, and so I didn't really get into it until later. But I found myself always wanting something heavier and heavier whenever my dad would play George Thorogood or the like. He was a big Eric Clapton guy, but more rock as we were younger. I always found myself wanting something heavier and heavier, and then I found Metallica. That the Injustice for All, the first 30 seconds of Blackened just blew my mind. I listened to it over and over and over again before I even listened to the whole song. It was like that moment where it was like, this is what I should have been listening to all these years. So Metallica would be the first, my genesis into heavy metal.
Well, that's a good way to begin, I tell you that.
I would say so.
I mean, you had a good foundation. Your parents actually listened to rock music, but my family, I didn't grow up with my parents, so they listened to Spanish music, pop music. So that's what I was, disco. That's what I grew up on, listening to, WABC in New York on AM radio, not even FM. I didn't discover FM till I was like a teenager. I had no idea. I just listened to cassettes of Kiss music until 1980, and then I bought records, and I was listening to records and cassettes, and that was the main thing until that time.
Yeah, well, for a lot of when I was young, it was a lot of classical music too. So, I mean, that made sense. As I listened to more metal, I gravitated more towards the stuff that was based on classical music and less on the poppy end of it, like Poison and some of those guys where they were, still in the metal genre, but I was more gravitating towards the operatic style. That's why Iron Maiden's one of my favorites now, because I just, there's that aspect of the way Bruce sings. I like the heavier stuff too. I mean, I'm a big death metal guy. Death is one of my favorite bands. So, I mean, I've got a pretty wide breadth of what I like.
No, that's cool. I mean, one of the things that we're going to talk about is, besides obviously our favorite music and our favorite bands today, is with getting into the whole heavy metal. Something may or may not have got you into it, but you definitely drift away to a different, you start focusing in on something else. Like I, for a long time, listened to, hair metal, whatever you want. What they didn't call it that in the 80s when I was growing up, but I listened to a lot of that. But then I drifted away from that and got into Metallica, Anthrax, the Big Four, and then Celtic Frost and Venom, things like that. And then slowly faded back to the pop metal type stuff.
Well, I mean, you also had the benefit of going through all that time period, being young when metal really became a thing. in the 1970s. You had Black Sabbath and the origins of metal. So you kind of lived through all that time,
Right.
Seeing all those things. So you had the benefit of going through those evolutions. For me, it was going back and listening to the discographies, and I've always been a guy that starts where I can find it first, but then go through in order. I like albums. I like listening to, if I was going to go through Metallica, listen to Kill 'Em All and listen through their entire catalog and their evolution from their genesis to now. I think that's something that we're going to definitely be talking about. We're going to be debating, differences between albums, talking about...
We're going to talk about everything. I mean, the differences between albums, the differences between songs, the differences between musicians in the
musicians
band.
in the band,
in the band, musicians that came after, and all that stuff. I mean,
how things like Jakey Lee being in the band rather than Randy Rhoads would have affected the sound.
Oh, exactly. And those debates are going to continue to rage on for years to come. And that's the cool thing that we're going to do in this podcast is we're just going to open up the opinions, and hopefully when the listeners hear this, they'll be able to get on Facebook, get on Instagram, get on Twitter, and voice their opinions, and we can always talk about it. And that's going to be the cool part about this whole thing. Now, that being said, our main subject, so we figured out that this is how we got into metal. Our main subject today is going to be two things. One, we're going to discuss our favorite bands, our top 5 favorite bands. And then second, we're going to discuss what heavy metal means to us. And more specifically, when we hear the term heavy metal, what do we visualize in our mind? What do we see? Who represents metal? And in our minds, what's the first thing you think of when you hear the term heavy metal? So why don't you, Chris, tell me what your top 5 favorite bands are?
All right. So I would say number 1 would be Iron Maiden. It's a difficult call for me sometimes to pick number 1, but at the time being, Iron Maiden is number 1. They have such a huge catalog of amazing albums. Even their worst albums are better than some of the lesser bands' best albums.
Yeah, of course.
And even through all the changes, the Paul Di'Anno era, the first Bruce era, the Blaze era, the second Bruce era, the current one, they've been able to keep true to themselves and put out a product that they love, they care about. They don't cater to the public and say, oh, we're only going to go out and play the hits. They play everything. They still put out great albums and commit to that. They do tours where they play just the songs from their new albums with a few of the hits, but that's what they're all about. And I just, above all others, I just love them. And if I'm going to pick a favorite album from Iron Maiden, since it's my number 1, I'm going to say Number the Beast.
I hear you. I like that. That's probably my favorite album, because that's the album that I got into Maiden with, and that was back in 1982 when the album came out. And I agree with you. Iron Maiden is one of my top favorite bands. It's not my number 1. They are my number 2. My number 1 is Metallica. But continue with your list, and we'll go over everybody as we get along.
I would say it's difficult for me to place the 2 through 4 in the exact order, but I'm going to bring up Children of Bodom. They just pretty much ended their career, I believe. They haven't fully committed to that because I think the name is still kind of up in the air. But they're a symphonic death metal band that has been around since the early 90s. Or late 90s, actually, 1997. But one of my favorites of all time. I can find something I love in every album. Maybe not so much I Worship Chaos, which was one of the last ones, but everything they've done, it just appealed to me, maybe from the classical end of things. There's a lot of synth to the music as well, which I very much enjoy. I would say Judas Priest has got to be on that list. Painkiller was just that album that just blew my mind. I started in the later catalog with British Steel and went on from there, but went back and listened to all the earlier stuff as well. There's just so much of just history there. Even the Ripper years, I really love those 2 albums. Jugulator being the better of the two, but everything that they did, I could find love in, and even Nostradamus, the concept album, which I'm looking at Dean's face and I'm seeing. Yeah.
I can't get into that album. It's not anywhere. I mean, that would be. It goes right there at the bottom between Rock and Roll and Nostradamus, or bringing up the rear on that for me. But
I mean, Rock and Roll is a tough listen because it's just so aged at this point.
Oh yeah.
But there's still some cool stuff on there, and I mean, if it's played in the later years, the instrumentation's a bit different, and I can still really appreciate everything that they did back then,
yeah, of course.
and evolving from a hard rock band into the metal god Rob Halford.
Yeah. So you got Iron Maiden, you got Judas Priest, you got Children of Bodom. Who else? You got two more.
I would say Death. I mean, Death.
Did you mention Death?
I did mention Death earlier, but not during this segment. Death may very well be number 2 for me. And I know I'm going in an odd order, but Chuck Schuldiner, just amazing musician. If you're not familiar with Death, it was more of a project than a band per se, but the guy worked with some of the most fantastic musicians that this world has ever seen. Fretless bassist, Steve DiGiorgio, Richard Christie, who appeared on Howard Stern later on. Just everyone he worked with contributed to each album as a project and an art piece. He was more about creating something that he loved with each album. So a lot of people know that he worked with 40 different guys in the band. Well,
right.
That was to create the best piece that he felt he could put out every time. And I'll go more into Death over the course of the whole show. But
was Chuck's idea of the band Death? Was it supposed to be a band, or was it supposed to be a single project, and he just brought the best players for each time he made a new project?
That's more along the lines. I think originally he wanted a band, but things just didn't always work out, and the guys that he was playing with couldn't always go across the country with him and stuff like that. So it ended up just being more of a conglomeration of writing of his.
Okay, number 5, or a fifth one is who?
Number 5 might be tough for me. I'm gonna have to go with. I'll go with Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, they were one of those bands that I was just enthralled with from all the different incarnations of the band. You had Ozzy, which the first 6 albums were they're classics. They're just perfect. Then you have the Dio years. Obviously, there were 2 more albums with Ozzy, but they weren't quite as good. And that was evident from the breaking up of the band twice during that time. Then there was the Dio years. Both of those albums, the first 2, were so good. Then you got all the history with all the different everything afterwards. Tony Martin, Glenn Hughes.
Jakey Lee for a while. Not Jakey Lee, excuse me. I'm talking about the singer. What's his name? Ray Gillen.
Well, you had Ray Gillen, who didn't record an album,
right.
but he was on the demo tapes for Eternal Idol.
Right.
But you also had Ian Gillan from Deep Purple for one album with Born Again. And so there's just so much history there. There's more great albums than you can count on 1 or 2 hands. And it was just one of those things that just enthralled me, almost like how Kiss has so many members of the band. Black Sabbath just has this story to tell that you follow throughout the years, and I think they were put together between 1970s to 1995. Over 15 albums, and they were one of those that it was more the mystique of the band that really just made me just obsessed with them for a long time. And I'm going to just put an honorable mention in there as Scorpions. And the reason why as Scorpions, because it's funny, I've never thought of them as my top tier, like top 10 band.
Right.
But I look at the amount of times that I've listened to Scorpions where I just I don't know what to listen to. So I'm like, oh, Scorpions. And I'm like, that's really telling that's the band, my go-to of who when I don't know what to do, I pretty much always go to Scorpions.
That's like that with me and Anthrax, or there's a couple of those bands, but like Anthrax or Whitesnake or Twisted Sister, those three are always going in and out of my playlist of stuff that I listen to, even though they're
like
not
under the
top.
radar, but
Right.
they're up there.
Exactly. Well, you mentioned your 5 and an honorable mention. We mentioned before that Iron Maiden was one of my favorites. They're my number 2. My number 1 is Metallica. I heard Metallica in 1985, I think it was, for the first time. I heard the song Whiplash. I was blown away. Couldn't believe that song, music could be played that fast. And from there, it's been a love affair all the way through to today, because there's almost nothing you can tell me that's going to discourage me from listening to Metallica. There's nothing you can tell me that's going to discourage me from liking Metallica. I even like Saint Anger. The only thing I don't like out there, okay, is I don't like.
There's my reaction to his. That's Nostradamus for
Right,
me.
exactly. I don't like Lulu, but I don't consider that a Metallica
That's not
album.
a true Metallica album. It's a Lou Reed featuring
Right.
Metallica.
But everyone's going to always bring that up. What about Lulu? Well, Lulu was terrible, but if you listen to it instrumentally, it's probably not a bad album. And I think it's available out there somewhere where you can listen to it instrumentally and not have to hear Lou Reed and his droning words. I didn't get it. I didn't particularly like it either. But Metallica is just, again, I mean, I've seen them the most. I've gone to Arkansas to see them. I've seen them in Miami. I've seen them in Houston. And so they are up there as my number 1. Iron Maiden, number 2. I've seen Iron Maiden the second most times in concert. You and I went recently to the Legacy of the Beast tour in September.
Amazing show. Probably the best show I've ever seen in my life.
I mean, it's right up there. It's got to be my top 5 because, I saw the World Slavery Tour in 1985. That was my first show. And that, it still probably ranks as my number 1 just because it was the first one and it was just amazing. Especially to be seen in a small venue like Radio City Music Hall in New York. So that's it. I date myself, but I don't care. Okay. All right. And the band that I had mentioned earlier that started it all off, Kiss, they're my number 3. They were there. They were not there for me, but I was there for them through thick and thin. I mean, I was there through the Dynasty period, through the Elder period, through Creatures of the Night, all that thin stuff. And I stuck with them. I listened to them in the 80s. One of my best friends in high school was a big Kiss fan. And so, Rob, if you're out there, hi, how you doing? So Kiss, the only reason they got lowered was because my love affair with Metallica has just gotten stronger and stronger and stronger over the years.
And obviously your love affair with Iron Maiden.
Even stronger today than ever, I tell you that much, because Iron Maiden, it's just amazing. All right, so number 4 is going to be AC/DC for me. Again, they basically became the second band that broke me into hard rock and
definitely
heavy metal.
in my top 10, especially Bon Scott era.
Oh yeah, I saw that movie when it came out in 1980, and it just blew me. I knew nothing about the band. I had never heard a song from AC/DC. I had never once even heard a riff, a note, anything. And then I saw the marquee in a movie theater back then, when you can actually, when they had marquees and they only played one movie at the theater. And it was, that, and it's funny, $5 is what it cost at the time. And that was really expensive in 1980. And because most movies were like $2.50, $3. So $5, I got to see this concert movie, and it just blew me away. And I'm like, I went straight to the record store, which was right across the street, and I bought Back in Black, not knowing that it was a different singer. But it's amazing to get the best album.
Well, I mean, speaking of which, with Bonfire, that tribute that they released to Bon Scott, they inexplicably released Back in Black on that set.
Conspiracy theories. We'll get into that too as the episodes come on. And finally, a very strange pick, and not necessarily strange for me, for anybody who knows me, but when you compare it to everybody else, my number 5 favorite band of all time is Queensryche. And I got into Queensryche really early on. I believe The Warning had just been released. I'm not exactly sure, but I saw the video for Queen of the Reich on some video channel. It wasn't MTV. It was some local some local high school video station Played this video and I was like, wow, what is this? Super cool riff, the screaming, the theatrics in the video, the dress up, the garb, all that stuff was just, this is at the time was heavy metal. It was hard rock, it was glam metal, whatever it was awesome. And so I instantly got hooked, ran out, bought the EP, bought the first album, and I've been a fan ever since. And you and I are going to go see them in a few weeks.
That's true. So, I've never been a big Queensryche fan, but I am a fan of live bands. And Dean gave me a list of Queensryche songs to listen to, and there was some really good stuff on there. So I'm interested to see them. You know, I'm sure seeing them live is going to be a better experience as well.
Oh, it's also, you know, the House of Blues is such a small venue. It's relatively intimate, so you just get to see them right up in front.
Oh, absolutely. If you live in Houston, the House of Blues is a great venue. It's just you have a intimate setting while still being big enough to house quite a few people.
Yeah, I mean, I met Queensryche at the Scout Bar in Houston, South Houston, and that
also a good venue.
That's a small place.
It's small, but because it's small, it's so intimate. It's awesome.
It was awesome. Man.
I got to meet David Vincent there and talk to him and you know, just sit and kind of pick his brain for a couple hours. David Vincent, singer of Morbid Angel.
All right, so we've talked about
I should say former lead singer of Morbid Angel. Yeah,
you got it. So you've heard our top 5 favorite bands. Chris's 5, my 5, honorable mentions, and all that stuff. So now we're going to talk about what heavy metal means to us, what we see in our minds when we think of heavy metal, who we see, who represents it the most. I'm going to let Chris talk about what he thinks is heavy metal. So Chris, when you hear the term heavy metal, what comes to mind? Who comes to mind, and what comes to mind?
It's kind of an odd thing to say, but to me, heavy metal is kind of comfort. It was a big way that I met a lot of my friends in my life. It was a comfort zone in all the changes because I moved around a lot, met a lot of people over the years, but it was the one thing that really just, you know, brought me closer to other people. You know, I remember being in college and one of my best friends now came up to me and said, "Hey, is that an In Flames shirt?" And I was wearing a Clayman shirt from their tour in Houston. And, well, the U.S. tour, but they're, you know, right. Stop in Houston. And I was like, yeah, this, you know, it's from Clayman. And he goes, "I like every album up to that album." So it was funny. We had a discussion right there, and you know, we over the years just became friends. We've been friends since 2005. So it was like that everywhere I went. I mean, I can go into a Jimmy John's like I did the other day, and I'm wearing an Iron Maiden shirt, and the guy's just kind of like, you know, thank you. Here's your sandwich. Is that an Iron Maiden shirt? You know, so
yeah. I mean, I had the same experience when I went to the movies. I was wearing an Iron Maiden shirt, and a kid, no less, opened the door for me by chance, and he's like, "Hey, nice shirt." You know, it was one of the tour shirts when we went to see the Legacy of the Beast tour. So yeah, and I totally understand and jive with the fact that it's one of those things that does bring people together.
Yeah,
oddly enough,
just it. In the early days, I mean, not so much now. If you've been in a mosh pit in the last few years, it's a lot of kung fu fighting and bullshit like that. But mosh pits were always kind of a fun place to be, and you know, it just that energy, everybody feeling the same thing, enjoying the music. It was a place to belong. And as far as like who represents metal to me, I gotta say that the person that in my mind's eye, if I close my eyes, is probably the electric eye, Rob Halford,
the metal god.
The metal god. I mean, Judas Priest in general, but Rob Halford, he has the attitude. He's just such a staunch supporter. If there's anybody just out there waving a flag for metal, it's Rob Halford.
Yeah, he sweats metal.
He does. I mean,
like Adrian Smith oozes cool. Okay, Rob Halford sweats metal.
Yeah, I mean, he's just that guy. He's supportive of all the young bands that are coming up. He's a good guy. So humble and just just such a staunch supporter of metal. So when I think of the genre, it's got to be him.
And that's, there's nothing wrong with that. That's for sure. I mean, he definitely epitomizes what heavy metal is. He's the one who created the look that everyone adopted. The
leather,
Kiss.
Motorcycle.
Right, exactly. I mean, Kiss can sit there and say, "Oh, they had leather and studs," but I mean, you really think about the way Gene looked in '74 and '75. He had that leather cape that had studs on it, and he had that cod piece. But realistically, they were wearing satin spandex, and they had some belts on, but it wasn't the look that eventually got adopted by Rob.
But yeah,
that became the look of heavy metal. I mean, Iron Maiden looked exactly like Rob Halford when they walked around, in 1980 and in 81.
And it wasn't just the leather. I mean, even before that with the denim and stuff like that. I mean, every incarnation of not just the way they looked, but the way the attitude that they had, that was metal. I mean,
right.
And I'm going back to Judas Priest and not just Rob, but I mean, they were a big part of it as well.
Right. No, of course. Heavy metal to me, it is very similar to what you were saying when you're talking about the feeling of community, the feeling of brotherhood, because very similar to when you met your friend, was George that you met?
Yes.
Right? So I mentioned earlier,
George.
My friend Rob, he was one of my best friends in high school. I was 10th grade. I was sitting behind him in architecture class, and I mentioned, I think we had 5 minutes left on the school day, and I mentioned, all right, I'm going home tonight and I'm watching a new Kiss video for Heaven's on Fire because it premieres tonight on MTV. And he turned around. I mean, he spun his head so fast it almost fell off. He's like, "You like Kiss?" And I'm like, "Hell yeah, I like Kiss." He's like, "Cool." And we were tight for 3 years at that point, and that's the way, it became. Someone saw a shirt, someone saw someone else with long hair, it was automatically we should or could be friends, and that was always a cool thing about metal. You don't get that in a lot of other genres. I mean, rap, it's kind of almost understood.
Have each other's backs, because
exactly. Pop music and all that stuff was, everybody liked that, but metal was different. It was like a tribe to a degree. And when I think of heavy metal, when I sit there and close my eye and I hear what is heavy metal to me. Heavy metal to me is Iron Maiden. And not because Metallica is not metal, obviously they are, but there's something about Iron Maiden that when you saw them, especially in 1982, on the back of the album cover, they're all wearing leather jackets and studded belts, but on tour they looked a lot different. The spandex pants, the studded belts.
You got to move.
Yeah, you got to be able to stretch and stuff like that. But it was just a look, and they epitomized it. And so when I think about metal, I think about Iron Maiden, and just from there it expands. Obviously, the music is just amazing. I can't say anything bad about anything that Iron Maiden has put out. That's for sure. I mean, I can
say a few bad things about the Blaze era, but
even then,
there's still some good songs.
But if you think about even with the Blaze era, everyone criticized the Blaze era, but if you think about it, I mean, on this Legacy of the Beast tour, they played 2 songs from the Blaze era, the Sign of the Cross and the Klansman. So they picked one song from each album. And even then, if you look at the first few songs off of X Factor, those first 4 songs were pretty good. They just weren't Bruce.
Well, and that's just the thing. I mean, I understand completely why they picked Blaze as their next singer. He fit the band. He didn't have the voice that appealed to as many people, and it may be just that he didn't fit with that band. They had already been through the big change with Paul Di'Anno, and then you go to Bruce, and with Bruce for so long that it was hard to accept that change.
I think the mistake with Blaze, as much as you see that how he fit, I didn't see how he fit at all. I think they needed to have
lyrically.
Someone,
that's what I mean.
Okay, but I think they needed someone more than lyrically because they had a past that they needed to represent, and I think that's where they failed to meet what people were looking for.
He wasn't the showman that Bruce is and who is. I mean, really, who is the showman that Bruce is?
There's not many people who can keep up with that guy.
Yeah, I mean, even Rob Halford doesn't move around the stage. Like, he could probably fill in a show for Bruce, and people would be like, "Oh my God, that was amazing!"
Right.
But yeah, he's not gonna move around the stage and do all the things, the antics that he does.
No, not at all.
Shoot flames through a flamethrower while singing. I mean, it's amazing stuff.
Yeah. But Blaze failed on that level. His voice was so different from Bruce's, and to think that he was going to be able to even replicate half of what Bruce was able to sing, that's where I think Steve Harris failed in picking Blaze as Bruce's replacement. I think there could have been a lot of other people, and maybe even people that we don't know, that probably had a better voice that was more attuned to what Iron Maiden was at the time.
Yeah.
Maybe it was about songwriting. Maybe they did get together in the stable or whatever.
I think that's what they were intending to do. I think that he was trying to pick, and I say he as in Steve, was trying to pick a guy that fit along the lines of what he wanted the direction of the band to go in, and that was in the lyrical sense. And they were kind of like darker albums than the previous ones. They were a little more serious and less tongue-in-cheek, and that had always been Maiden's thing. And maybe Steve was just going with what he felt at the time. And I'd like to know more about that myself. I mean, do a little bit more research. But the
90s were kind of dark.
They were a dark time. They were the Empire was taking over, and it was a dark time. I mean, grunge music was around. Metal was kind of going by the wayside,
right.
And it was a lot of bands were changing to remain or rewriting. What they were putting out, and Iron Maiden wasn't really doing that. Other than they were forced to make those changes with Bruce leaving the band. Yeah,
they were. And it's unfortunate, but at the same time, it became something where now they're almost virtually unstoppable. I mean, it's amazing what they're doing out there.
And they're even bigger around the world than they are here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to think about being able to sell out the stadiums that they sell out,
absolutely,
and the tours that they do. I mean, it's bigger and better than ever. So.
And again, no slight to Blaze, because he did carry the banner during the time that Bruce was gone, and still put out some great songs. Future Real comes to mind as my favorite Blaze era song,
and that's off of Virtual 11, which
that
album is
most
not
derided.
Right, everyone rips that album, but the Klansman's on there, Future Real's on there. There's probably good 4 songs on that album.
And the Klansman was one of the standouts to me at the Iron Maiden show. Was just
that was amazing.
Yeah, and not because obviously the classics are gonna appeal more, but hearing that song sung by Bruce and just not really knowing it as well because I wasn't as big into the Blaze era, that was amazing. That was great.
It was. So if you had to pick between Sign of the Cross and the Klansman, which one do you like?
The Klansman, for sure. Okay. I enjoyed that song a lot more.
Me too. I think the Sign of the Cross, it's a good song, but it's not as strong as the Klansman.
Oh, for sure.
So Chris, next week we're going to be talking about our favorite debut albums, and we're going to be introducing a new segment called The Big Four. We all know the Big Four of thrash, so in this segment we'll be picking what we feel is the Big Four in any category, be it bass players or songwriting teams. So that's all for this week on Debating Metal. I'm the Dean of Metal, Kenneth Dean.
And I'm Chris Kaye. We'll see you next week. If you enjoyed our podcast or just want to rip our opinions a new one, follow us at facebook.com/debatingmetalpodcast. or Instagram at Debating Metal. And we'll be setting up more social media over the next few weeks.
And so for the next few weeks, you can find us on Podbean while we work on getting on all the major platforms so you can listen to your favorite podcast, Debating Metal.